What's up, guys? It's JJ. With the 4th of July holiday this week and the launch of the late round draft guide, I'm taking a little vacation with my family. But I still wanted you guys to have some content. I've been doing Becoming a Best Ball Bro for a handful of episodes now, and there's been so much great information shared by the guests who have come onto that show. Some of you maybe haven't heard that information, or you've just straight up forgotten about it. So on today's episode, we're doing a little recap. With the help of my co-host Rich Ryan, you'll hear some of the best advice that's been given over the last month and a half of that show. It'll get you ready for best ball drafts that are upcoming here in July and August. This is really best ball season. So happy 4th of July, enjoy your time with family and friends, and know that I'll be back in your ears early next week. I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years, but there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have, and I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest, and I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Mr. Kerrane, I got a question for you. I know the answer is probably both to this question, but what do you think is more important in best ball? Simply choosing the right players, which is sort of a mantra that some fantasy analysts go to, or having proper roster construction?
I mean, if you were going to let me have all the league winners or a portfolio of perfectly constructed rosters, I'd take the league winners. I think it's more important to have those guys, but the thing is, where do we actually have control? And we have some control on picking the right players. I spend a lot of time on player analysis and stuff. But I think as a best ball player, especially if you're newer to best ball and you're trying to kind of level up, focusing on roster construction is really the low-hanging fruit, because that's where you actually have a lot of control and you can make huge improvements. And then the other thing I would say with roster construction is when you think about the type of tournament that you're playing. If you're an Underdog's Best Ball Mania, that's not a tournament that rewards the big prize to whoever scored the most points week 1 through 17. It's not that kind of tournament. In that kind of tournament, you probably need all the best players in that season because it's just who scored the most points. This is a tournament that has 4 different, basically qualifying. It has 3 qualifying entries and a final week in week 17. It leads to the situation where maybe the very best group of players doesn't even take it down. It's really a team that was structured to peak at the end of the season and win a single week in week 17.
Would you say then that your roster construction is sort of dictating your exposure to players in a way and going that direction? Or are you out there seeking these individual players, obviously to some degree, and then sort of letting roster construction fall into place after that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, to me, the whole question is what can I get later and what can I not get later? Mm-hmm. And this is my site's called Legendary Upside because I think in the early rounds, you want to be looking for running backs who have legitimately legendary upside, who can shift the season to be about them. And you can't get that later usually. Last year, I thought Breece Hall gave us an opportunity to get that. But that was because of very specific circumstances where he's coming off this ACL tear. Most of the time, you have to pay a first or second round pick to get that kind of upside at running back. And I think it's worth it to pay for it, but you want to be shooting for that. You want to be examining where in the landscape you think there's significantly mispriced players and then attack those spots, but understand that essentially you have a budget. Your draft picks, you could kind of equate them to auction dollars, or you've got basically a budget of picks that you're going to be spending. And you don't want to be, coming out of the draft way overspent at running back compared to wide receiver. I would say the fundamental thing is don't come out of a draft really light at wide receiver, especially on Underdog right now. That's pretty easy to do. And the historical data on basically every best ball mania that they've had shows that the wide receiver teams with sufficient firepower at wide receiver through the early rounds, through the first 7 rounds, Hayden Winks has done a lot of research on this, those are the consistently high scoring teams. So above all, I would say make sure you have sufficient wide receiver firepower through the first 7 to 10 rounds.
Let's talk about roster construction more a little bit. So what's your standard build look like? What has your standard build look like? You can even talk about your Best Ball Mania 3 winning team and what that looked like on paper in that roster construction. It was Best Ball Mania 3, yeah?
Best Ball Mania 3, yeah.
Yeah. Your big W. Yeah. And so, like, what did that look like? And do you see that changing and your approach changing in 2024? We obviously don't want to overstate, small sample sizes or like what happened last year and just take that data and, apply it to the 2024 season. But what's your roster construction generally look like? And is that changing here in 2024?
Yeah. So I won with a running back start, but my general approach, which I actually think is consistent with that team, is to be wide receiver heavy. The thing with that team is I didn't take my third running back until round 10, hit on Ramondre Stevenson there. And then I took 2 more running backs in the entire draft in round 16 and 17, hit on Raheem Mostert in the 16th. So I had 4 good running backs: Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler, Ramondre Stevenson, Raheem Mostert. I had 4 good running backs. The other one was Sony Michel. So that was a waste. So I had 4 good running backs on the team all season, which was more than enough. And I had enough wide receiver firepower to be able to take down week 17, where I had Tom Brady go off with Chris Godwin stack, DJ Moore bring back was a really important element of that. Austin Eckler carried that team that week and for much of the season. And like I was saying, I mean, I think if you hit on a early round running back, it really can be game changing. The trick is, if you're going to go running back, you are way behind at wide receiver now. Right. That's okay. It doesn't mean you can't go running back. It just means you have to play it like you're way behind from that point forward. If you get, an awesome value on Josh Jacobs in the 5th, like, I'm sorry, man, like that's not for you. That's someone else is getting that. You know?
It's rough. That's a tough thing to do. So you're saying, you're advocating in those situations, because a lot of people are going to be stuck in those situations while they're drafting, right? Where they like earlier today, I'm looking at one of my drafts. I didn't get any Houston Texans wide receiver early on in my draft, right? And a lot of times you'll see this happen where, the teams that get, let's say they get a Nico and a Stephon Diggs or something like that in 2-3. And then later in the draft, they decide to skip on CJ Stroud in the 5th. And then Stroud, because no other team really cares about stacking him, Stroud just falls and he has this fall. Stroud got to the early 7th in this draft that I was in, but I had already gotten Lamar and Mark Andrews, and I had to skip on it, right? Yeah. Like it's so painful, but you're advocating, you're saying that's probably the right thing to do in that instance.
That's the right thing to do in that instance. Your team, if it wins all the money, is going to show up in week 17 against a bunch of other teams. If you show up with a Lamar Andrews stack and your 7th round pick is CJ Stroud, you're going to be like, what the heck am I doing? Right. Give me any other 7th round pick than CJ Stroud right now.
Right.
Your path to the money is very clearly Lamar goes nuts and his touchdowns go through Andrews, and then you're very live, but you want a 7th round pick who's going to hit your lineup, and Stroud cannot if Lamar is hitting your lineup. So you can talk yourself into, this team's more likely to advance, but you're really you just want that value. You just want that sweet CJ Stroud value, but you box yourself out of it, and you just have to play it like that.
As we know, the structure of these tournaments are, as you said, there's this 4-week playoff, and you get to the last week, and you want to have a team that's heavily correlated, because if that game hypothetically blows up, if you have a Jacksonville, Tennessee stack and that game goes nuts and nuclear in week 17, then that's good for your squad to get a good payout. My question to you is, number one, how important is game stacking week 17? How much should you force it? Which I know is one of those questions that I hate getting as an analyst, is how much, because it's just really hard to give a percentage or a direct answer to something like that. But just generally speaking, how frequently are you sort of forcing the game stack? And then my follow-up to that is, do you think because of the flatter payout structure this year, especially with Best Ball Mania, that people should or might want to focus a little bit more on week 16 just to get in the dance and just to get there week 17 and be able to compete, because they know that, okay, even if I get 20th, that's still a decent payout?
Yeah, the week 16 discussion has been interesting, because some of the math shows that if you could basically pull a lever that was do better, you would want to pull that lever in week 16 because it occurs first. And so, you're getting into week 17. So if you just had a do better, lever, I think you would pull at week 16. The problem is we don't really have that lever. We have a lever in game stacking that's kind of like add a little risk, but score maybe like a gajillion points. And I think that lever is better pulled in week 17 when you have to beat 500 plus people instead of 15. You know, you're kind of like, if you're trying to find this unicorn game that goes nuts and scores like all the points, give that to me in the 500 plus field. I think that seems pretty clear to me, but I do understand that like we want to be doing stuff that improves our chances of week 16, and week 16 is more important than it was last year. To me, can be like things like same team stacking, which helps you in week 16, week 15, which is also a single week tournament, week 17. Same team stacking also helps your advance rate. So that I think with week 16, I'm mostly trying to either get it for free, where I'm getting a player who plays a team in week 16 and week 17. I like that. Or I'm trying to focus on, adding in like same team elements, or just kind of the overall archetype of late season production. Rookies, guys who might be coming on down the stretch, contingent value running backs, that type of thing. But yeah, this is a tournament where we do really need to be focusing on the fact that it is a single week tournament, and whoever scores the most points in week 17 is going to win all the money. So I think game stacking is pretty important, and I don't think you want to force it. Like there's a wrong way to do this, right? We don't want to add like like I'm very kind of like, if I see a running back who's got a lot of projected touches, but I don't think he's very good, that's like usually a guy I'm going to avoid, because I'm like, that's a very fragile bet to be making for a guy who I need to be scoring a lot of points in week 17. That's literally in December. It's a long time away. I need this to go a long time. I need to make a prediction that's going to survive for a long time. I see people now, like they're making a prediction that the 49ers and the Lions are going to score a ton of points in December. And they're taking like Sam Laporta to pair with CMC, like, 8 picks ahead of where he used to be going. That to me is not the way to do this, because like we don't know anything. Right. We don't know anything about what these games. There's going to be defenses that are riddled with injuries that we're attacking. They're the clear spots to play in DFS. There's going to be breakout offenses that are super underpriced in retrospect. What you're trying to do with the week 17 and the stacking in general is to find one of those spots where you're collecting a bunch of wins with one bet. So you bet on one offense, you bet on one game, and lo and behold, it's the nuts. It's what you need.
Yeah.
There's no way we can know that now. And that's the point. So the cheaper that you can make these bets, like I'm betting a lot on the Patriots, on the Broncos, some of these like late offenses where I can scoop up a bunch of pieces. The other thing is, if you're kind of building it in, you're not committing the whole draft. So for example, let's say you take Ladd McConkey. If you don't get Justin Herbert, it's not a big deal. What I will try to do, I will try to get Justin Herbert. I will kind of keep building Chargers. But if I don't get Justin Herbert, I have also set myself up for a week 17 game stack with the Patriots. Right. And I can add those Patriots pieces later, and I can add Drake May as a quarterback 2 or quarterback 3 if I want to do that. So you're kind of like, if you just kind of keep it in the back of your mind, you can use it to add flexibility to your draft so that you're like never boxed out of stuff, or it's much harder to box you out of things. If you overly focus on it, I think you can make mistakes.
So Hayden, you recently wrote an amazing article. We'll be referencing the article a lot throughout today's interview, but you looked at what sort of worked well, or what's worked in general during all 4 years of Best Ball Mania. But before we sort of dig into all of that, I just want to ask you, just generally speaking, do you think that the market, the way that people are drafting, average draft position, all that good stuff, do you think the market might sort of overemphasize some of the historical data that we're looking at because of limited samples? Or do you think that, and I'm not saying that what you looked at was incorrect, it was absolutely what we need, like inject that content right into me, right? But do you think that there is some limitation, or do you think that like the market is just like looking at what happened last year and then just overemphasizing what's going to happen then this year?
It depends on who you ask. Some people believe it's nearly useless. Others think it's everything. I'm obviously somewhere in between. And my whole philosophy with this is, the more we zoom into things, the noisier the data is, because we are more or less working off 4 seasons of data here. But if we kind of zoom out, then I think some of the other principles like diminishing returns and other kind of philosophies that go into best ball start getting evened out, and I actually start believing in the data. And what I mean by like zooming in, if we like looked at, for example, which positions to draft in the first and second rounds. Well, in the first 2 years of Best Ball Mania, it would have said draft running back starts. And if we applied that for Best Ball Mania 3 and Best Ball Mania 4, then we would have lost a lot of money because the wide receiver teams then became the teams to draft in the early rounds. So if you're just trying to zoom in on which players to draft in rounds 1 and 2, that's where I think the small sample size, that's where I think the noise is. But if I say you should draft 5 or 6 running backs by the 18th round, I think all of a sudden that sample size is growing there. And the other kind of example that I keep using is if you zoom in on the, should I draft an elite tight end over the last 4 years? Well, you're zooming too far in on, is Travis Kelce good or not? And rather than like, how is this position going to evolve once Travis Kelce is out of the prime of his career? Same thing with some of the other elite tight ends. So I want to kind of like walk this line of how, like, obviously zooming in is helpful for finding the exact strategy. But if we zoom in too close on a small sample size, you're going to be led astray way too often.
I feel similarly to player win rate data where, a lot of people say, oh, well, this player last year, won at a 16% clip or whatever. So he was better than any other typical player in his range, etc. But sometimes you look at that player, and I've only done it at like a high level, but sometimes you'll look at it and those players are simply dictated by ADP, it seems like, where like if they're, last season, Christian McCaffrey, let's say, goes 4th overall or 3rd overall, wherever he went. And then the player in the second round who's going, third to last in the second round, and then the 2-3 turn guys, they all, even if they were terrible, it didn't matter because they were all attached to Christian McCaffrey in that way. Is that similar to what you're sort of saying here?
Yeah, you see that. The other example with that is, let's say the wide receiver 3 on a team that went off didn't perform well, but the quarterback and the wide receiver 1 and everyone's stacking. All of a sudden, that player that wasn't even in the lineup just happened to be on the same team. So there's too much overlap. So I think like because there's only 4 years of data, we have to be really smart with how we're applying some of the data. I think if you completely said it's small samples noise, I'm not using anything, that's going to be a problem. But for me, we really have to kind of take some of the data, but also just like, does this make sense? Like as a strategy, does this make sense? And then the other thing, what we're seeing, and we have a question about this later on, also what's happened with ADP. Because if I'm taking the data where all of the running backs were drafted in rounds 1 and 2, but now those type of players are being drafted in rounds 3 and 4, now like our strategies are completely getting warped just because the prices have changed as well. So it's a fun game because I think we can kind of put some guardrails on like the general strategies, but every single year we're going to have to see what ADP is looking like, what the player projections are looking like. And then also not just for like the player projections in the first couple rounds, but who's available later in the rounds. Because if I think that there's a positions loaded in rounds 14 through 18, well, I want to save some of the roster spots for those guys later on. So it's this whole game that we have to play, and every single year is going to be a little bit different.
You also did a lot of work at the tight end position. I've been on record. I talked about this with Kerrane last week. I've said this on the show already in the past, but I think that the way people approach tight end might end up making or breaking some seasons this season, just because, we've seen, like you said, was Travis Kelce good or not this year with these earlier round tight end approaches. We've seen that, but this year we don't have that kind of tight end. The earliest tight end is Sam Laporta, who I think probably doesn't belong necessarily in his like own tier where he gets drafted. I feel like the Laporta thing is a little bit of a stack force type situation, with a St. Brown and like getting one of the San Francisco wide receivers. But regardless, even if you like Sam Laporta, tight end 1 in his own tier, I mean, he's still going late 3rd into early 4th oftentimes. And so we're getting this like this drop in tight end, the elite tight ends and where they're going. What do you think that means for 2024 and whether or not going with an elite tight end is really the way? Because I know that you've talked a lot about going in the opposite direction in these drafts too.
Mm-hmm. So the reason why there's not a first or second round tight end where we've been drafting Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews at times, is because those guys just aren't in the primes of their career. Like if you just did projections, they just would not project as well this year as they did previously. So to me, I don't want to say, oh, well, the tight end one is typically the 12th overall pick, and now he's a 30th overall pick, so I must draft them. I think we're looking at Sam Laporta. He does not project as well as prime Travis Kelce, prime Gronk, prime Tony Gonzalez. You name the player. He's a good player. He could do that. I'm not ruling that out, but it's not as bankable as the prime guy. So I don't think that's like the way I want to look at this. I want to like really stick with the player projections for this upcoming season, because it goes back to the first question: is there is no historical data telling me is an elite onesie player good or not, because the sample size literally is just, is Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews good or are they bad? And that varies depending on the season, just because it's such a small sample. So what's actually happened is the rest of the elite tight ends, like let's say tight end 4, tight end 5, tight end 6, those guys are actually up a full round. And I think it's just because the wide receivers are up, the elite tight ends are up, and the running backs are down, like not exaggerating, like 2 full rounds from where they were 2 years ago. So like the running back 22 is now being drafted 2 full rounds versus where they were just 2 years ago. So that means that the tight ends are getting pushed up. So like a player like Dalton Kincaid, who could end up being Sam Laporta of this last season, something like that, he's now being drafted to me like pretty close to like where his ceiling more or less is. And like this, like kind of, we're extending the definition of elite tight end. Kyle Pitts is one, George Kittle's one. Typically the tight end 4, 5, 6, 7 are not being drafted as early as they are now. So it's kind of this like weird dynamic of, I don't even know who's an elite tight end anymore. Like it doesn't feel like anybody truly is to me. But the running back prices right next to these tight ends, a lot of the time, I'm kind of clicking them instead. Like I want the Isaiah Pacheco instead of the Sam Laporta or that. I do like Mark Andrews, who goes way later, but I don't think that there's like a true elite tight end right now, which is fine. It's hard to be prime Travis Kelce, but I don't think that's an excuse to say I'm drafting Sam Laporta in round 3, like you said.
What you're talking about, and the thing that I keep thinking about is like, it's almost a psychological problem where like when you go with 3 late round tight ends, on paper, they suck, right? Like on paper, it feels so uncomfortable, but you have to keep in mind what you're saying in that the range that you really need, like the ceiling that these tight ends need to hit in a given week is not very high. It's not super significant. And so even if they do bust in a given week, you're not dead, right? Whereas if that happens at other positions, you are kind of dead because there's a lot bigger of a gap there and more points you'd be hypothetically giving up. So it makes a lot of sense. Do you ever go with 4 tight ends in these things, or are you strictly a 3 tight end guy?
So historically, 2 and 3 tight end teams have been like optimal, and it really just depends how early you're drafting your first guy, etc. 4 tight end teams have been pretty close to that, but I would have to like really look at it. I'm sure that's like, okay, rounds 15, 16, 17, 18.
Yeah.
Like it was like the last 4. And you do need one of those guys to break out most likely. Now, we have had some random breakouts. Like Darren Waller at one point was a late round pick, and then he finished top 5 on the year. Jake Ferguson was this close to being like a top 4 or 5 tight end if he had got a little bit luckier in the touchdown department. So we do get some like random breakouts sometimes as well. But I do think this year just doesn't look as good just because we had like 5 rookie tight ends last year that like were going to get on the field immediately. And we only needed 1 or 2 of them to break out. And that's exactly what we had.
Liam Murphy, do you like remember where you were when you drafted that Best Ball Mania winning team?
I'm like pretty sure I was on my couch because it was a June draft, and I'm pretty sure I was like on my couch watching a movie because I like roughly remember the start of Jonathan Taylor and Aaron Jones, because that year, you know, like, I mean, best ball's changed so much as far as like what's offered, but like that year, you know, there was all the like the Aaron Rodgers rumors of like, I can't quite remember what it was, but it was causing Devontae Adams and Aaron Jones to fall, and like allowed me kind of like unique combo due to like fear. Not that like Aaron Jones was essential to winning or anything, but I kind of remember that time cycle. So I'm pretty sure I was on my couch and watching a movie and drafting.
Just casually winning $1 million from your couch.
Yeah, just casually sun running, you know, from the couch, you know.
No big deal. What do you think then has separated you as a consistently good, successful best ball player? What do you think like separates you from maybe players who aren't as consistent or you know, aren't necessarily putting in the same? I mean, is it work that you're putting in? Is it a mentality that you have? What do you think really has been the separation piece for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say just me, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm the best ball player in the world, right? Like, results does not always mean you played well, right? Like, I think I'm a good best ball player. I do put in work. And I would say a couple things separates like a good best ball player from probably someone who needs a little bit of work, right? Ultimately, yeah, like a little bit of work will get you pretty far because most people are just not willing to even like do anything. They're just there. They're ripping their drafts. They're not doing anything. From the get-go, I've not been afraid to have like my own thoughts where back in Best Ball Mania 2 and before, there was almost no content on Best Ball. What little content you had was like people being like, oh, you can't stray too far from ADPs. Like the market is a really, correct force. And I was like, no, I think the market is like terrible in certain situations. So like I was getting like heavy ADP stands. As far as like anyone out there trying to improve their best ball game, it's kind of hard what to say because different people struggle at different things, right? Like some people probably just don't have good structural builds, right? Where they're just allocating too many running backs or too many wide receivers. Like back when the year I won BBM2, a big takeaway of mine was I was starting wide receiver heavy and ending up with too many of them. Right. Whereas like I was starting like 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds, but ending up with 9 of them. And, and like kind of my takeaway was I need to be, there's no reason to do that. Right. Like I need to believe that these 5 wide receivers I start with are gonna return value. They're gonna fill my starting lineup spots, and I need more darts at running back. Some people are not thinking about how do you win, right? How do you advance through these playoff groups? How do you beat people in the finals? They're more thinking of how do I advance? How do I beat my pod? Which, building a team that can beat your pod. Okay, it's got a chance to win, but it's made the playoffs. But it's not necessarily the same thing as like, how do I beat 500 people in the finals to win $1.5 million versus how do I, advance out? And then it's like best ball is like ultimately like a weekly upside game, right? Where like I think a player like Devon Achane represents this, right? Like some people are like, what is this guy doing being a second round, a third round pick, right? Like because they're thinking of like, what is his season long projection? They're thinking of the fact that like Mostert's going to see the field. Maybe Jalen Wright sees the field. Whereas anyone who plays best ball knows that Achane can literally give you 50 points and win you weeks, which is what you need.
Do you think that drafters are sometimes a little bit too rigid with their overall draft strategy, who they're taking, and they focus too much on previous season data, especially when it comes to best ball, where we've only had 4 of these tournaments. Like, and you mentioned it, like the first 2, especially ADP was not even remotely what it looks like today in terms of where positions were getting drafted, wide receivers going where they go today versus where they were going even 2 years ago. Do you think that people are possibly being a little bit too rigid with the way that they are approaching their roster construction right now?
100%, right? Because like I feel a lot of data that I hear, there's data that's descriptive, meaning it's describing what worked the past year, right? And then there's data that's predictive, which is like what we care about, right? And it's hard to isolate what is predictive versus descriptive. In best ball, what's especially complicated is you have injuries year to year, right? So if 5 running backs get hurt in the first round and you're just someone out there being like, late round running back smashed, right? But you're ignoring that like, well, 5 dudes tore the ACL. Like really you're just saying, okay, these guys got hurt last year. The other thing you have to think about is what is available later in drafts, right? So like if you're going to say, oh, late round running back is a smash this year, or for this year, late round tight end, right? Oh, late round tight ends always work. But me personally, I don't feel like the same tight end archetypes that have smashed in the late round are necessarily there this year, right? So you can't just copy and paste what worked the past year. I think another thing, and I've written about this one, which is another thing that I'm hearing a lot this year is why would I draft early when last year, if you drafted in August, you smashed because you got Puka Nacua, you got Kyron Williams, you got Tank Dell. And it's like, hold up, people. Like, let's add some context here. Do you think you're going to find a Kyron Williams every year? Do you think you're going to find a Puka Nacua every year? Do you think you're going to have Tank Dell scoring a preseason touchdown and bringing him from like nearly 0% drafted to 100% drafted? Like, of course not. You're not going to get that amount of value every single year, late round in drafts. And, as far as like drafting early, what if Breece Hall tears his ACL in August, right? Like, not wishing injury on anyone, but then Braylon Allen or whoever the Jets backup running back will go from an 18th round pick to literally a 3rd round pick or higher, right? So that's a lot of value for drafting early.
There's this discussion about getting a single elite quarterback and leaving it at that. And I just have to talk to you about the strategy because I haven't really dug in. I haven't talked to any of the sharps about this and what it all means. But this is literally get a Josh Allen. That's your quarterback. Take the 0 for his bye week, correct? And then kind of hope that he's just giving you those spiked weeks, week in and week out. And then obviously you can get an extra wide receiver, tight end, running back, etc. What's your take on that? And then I also want to sort of flip that and say, what's your take on double elite quarterbacks? So we'll say getting maybe 2 of the top 8 guys. So you're getting, putting like Kyler in that discussion.
Yeah, on this topic, I'd also like to bring up the single elite tight end because I often hear them discussed together, and I feel like they're very different things. When you're talking about a half-point PPR website, quarterback points are just mathematically worth more than a PPR website, right? So like if a quarterback puts up 40 on a half-point PPR website, they're making up a greater percentage of your score than on a PPR website because the wide receivers, the running backs, they strictly score less, right? So that generally draws me towards wanting elite QBs on underdog, right? Single elite quarterback is not something I purposely do a lot of the times. It doesn't mean I never do it. And if I were to do it, it's almost always going to be with Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. 2 guys who I think both have extremely high floors and high ceilings. A guy like Lamar Jackson, I think is more like a better and best ball quarterback where he actually has like kind of a low floor when the running backs steal all his touchdowns in close, right? Whereas Josh Allen and Hurts kind of like are their goal line backs. On this, I have to mention that my Best Ball Mania 2 team essentially was a single QB team because it was Josh Allen and Justin Fields. And that year, Fields like barely played. And when you look at like on Josh Allen's bye, Fields contributed like 2.7 points.
Yeah.
And then never hit the lineup any other week.
That's crazy.
Right. So it was just a Josh Allen team. So it's not something I do a lot. Why would you do it? Obviously, you would do it to get yourself extra bullets at running back, wide receiver, tight end, where you can separate, right? And like the whole thesis is QBs rarely separate where, if a quarterback puts up 40 points, okay, separating. But in the weeks where quarterbacks put up 25 to 15, even 30 to 20, you can make up the gap, right? Like when I won with Josh Allen, he scored 2 rushing touchdowns against the Falcons. So I had like 24 QB points. Joe Burrow put up 35. It didn't matter. I still made up the gap because I had the Rashad Pennies, the Amon-Ra, the Jamar Chase. Like I nutted out at the skill positions more. So single elite QB rarely, but I think it's okay to do occasionally. You just eat the 0. Still, why would you want a second quarterback? Just because you want low owned players, right? Because like when Kerrane won, he had Daniel Jones and Tom Brady, and funny enough, they both like were QB 1 and 2. One of them was really low owned though, right? So like in the year where like I can't remember which one was the higher owned one, but in the year where the higher owned one does not score well, and he has this low owned guy who puts up 35 points. Okay, now he's separating a little bit from the field.
Yeah,
single elite tight end is something I will never ever do. Because tight ends are, they're dependent on touchdowns. And so just thinking about how the playoff pods work and how ownership really condenses on players who score well. Like in BBM2, Mark Andrews had a great season, had a great week 16. And so all of a sudden, Mark Andrews was like 50% owned in the finals, right? So you would argue that you would want anyone else. And my Noah Fant, 5% owned, scored 2 touchdowns with Drew Lockett and Lock, So like you want a low owned tight end who falls in the end zone twice is extremely valuable, and you're separating from the field to potentially win life-changing money.
This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play best ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. That guide will then be emailed to you when it launches on July 1st. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. Justin Herzig, I had asked you sort of where you were at with Best Ball Mania, and I asked you strictly from a selfish perspective because I'm trying to sort of pace myself and understand like where others are at. I've talked to other folks like Liam Murphy, who is already like 50 drafts in by the time, June basically hit. But then I asked you that, and you gave me an answer that was kind of surprising. So can you share that answer with the folks listening?
Yeah, so I've probably done about 1,000 or so drafts, but I've only done one Best Ball Mania. And so the drafts that I've really been focusing on right now are the ones that are more time boxed, that they're going to close, and the information kind of gap from now to August, it doesn't exist because the contest is already closed. For me personally, and I'm not saying this is the right strategy for everyone, but I think that, hey, I live and breathe this stuff. I'm in a daily basis. I think my ability to kind of read through the noise, see what the important news is that comes out in July and August when we actually have the training camps, when we see who's running with the ones, when we see the potential usage stuff, that's where I feel I have a greater edge to actually kind of pull in the right levers to be drafting in that time period. And then also, when we think about things like combinatorial ownership, when we think about players that aren't drafted, knowing that, hey, I've got the entire Best Ball Mania already 70, 80% has been done. We know where players stand. We know who hasn't been drafted, where they've been drafted. That's where I think I have a greater edge in the August time period. Now, I understand I'm giving up some. So like, for example, Rashee Rice, he's been, being drafted in that kind of 7th round area. If he ends up with no suspension, he's back to that 2nd rounder, 3rd rounder. And I probably lost substantial edge to people who are doing that. Or if you get another injury situation where I think it was what the Cam Akers, where Darrell Henderson moves all the way up, like there's definitely downsides to not drafting this early. But for me and the way that I kind of play, the levers that I can pull, I think I have more edge come August time period. So specifically for Best Ball Mania, some of the larger contests I care the most about, I backload those as much as possible.
This is strictly non-analytical, but I would guess that there were way more Puka Nacua teams drafted in July and August last year than there were in May and June. But yeah, I mean, like the beauty with Best Ball and with Underdog in particular is that like it's not like the games and the contests that we're playing and dealing with are all summer long content. Like not every single one is spanning 4 months like Best Ball Mania. Like you said, you've still drafted 1,000 teams so far. There's plenty of other contests that you can choose from and sort of get into without having to worry about the 4 month information news dump as you are with Best Ball Mania. Let me ask you some other questions that's while looking at this landscape, this best ball landscape. Right now, to me, the 2nd round is really, really interesting because it feels like, last year, maybe even the year before, it seemed like there were some pretty solid, obvious picks in that range. This year, I think it's just a little bit more up in the air. And so my question to you, I've heard others on the show talk about this when asked, but my question to you is, has that forced you to sort of differentiate the way that you're looking at your 1st round pick to your 2nd round pick, and not going with just chalk, right? And not just going with, hey, I got Jahmyr Gibbs in round 1. Now I'm going to get Drake London in round 2. Has it forced you to look at maybe going with Jahmyr Gibbs and then maybe Nico Collins, who's usually more of a mid to 2nd round pick?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to this, but for me, now is not the right time to employ it if we're talking about a contest like Best Ball Mania that's going to last all summer. Because come August, or for tournaments that are time boxed, they're closing soon, that's when I'm using it. And so previously, if it's time boxed, I'll do it. Otherwise, I'm waiting till August, because consider you give the Gibbs Nico at the 1-2 turn. If you do that because you want to get unique, what if reports come out that, positive about Diggs or positive about Tank, and now Nico drops to the end of the third? Now people are getting that same combo that you thought was going to be unique, but they're still getting it, and they're getting that extra player, that extra Marvin Harrison, that extra Drake London in the second round. So come August, when we know when the ADP has looked like all over the summer, that's when we can be more confident in kind of the reaches to get that unique combinatorial ownership. And then on the other hand, rather at this time, I'm focusing more on kind of like, hey, are there unique or game stacks that I can get that we may not be able to get later on? So an example would be AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts. That'd be the first round, third round, fourth round. You can get those right now. It feels chalky because a lot of people are doing it, but who's to say that when we get to July and August, that combo is still going to be available? Maybe Jalen or Devontae move up. And now what we thought was chalky now ends up, it was only chalky for maybe 30% of the BBMs. And it's pretty rare to get later on, or people have to reach and do that in the first, second, and third round to get it. So that's where I'm kind of letting the draft from where we are, the meta of it right now. And I'd say, hey, now is where you'd focus on that unique Eagle stack that you may not be able to get later. And come August, we can then say, hey, that Jameer and Nico combo really hasn't been drafted much this entire time. Let me attack it now.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If you have a draft or a contest rather that is going to fill in 4 days, which we've seen frequently in Underdog because people are ferocious and degenerates, within that app. But if you know that a contest is going to fill, is that when you would maybe differentiate a little bit more in those first 2 rounds?
Yeah, and I mean, the way to think about it is the wide receivers that are going anywhere from, there are so many in that kind of second or third round that if you look at the projections and you were to give someone an extra 0.5% target share, that might jump them from the end of the third to the middle of the second. Like, these margins are so small, especially in that group of wide receivers. You can compare it to DFS, where if we were to think through like, okay, all of our weekly projections, maybe one player's projected for 15.9 and someone else is projected for 15.7. But there might be 10 or 12 guys in that mix. And now, if you're just looking at rankings, you're like, oh, this guy's 12 spots behind. Yeah, but if you're actually looking at projections on a weekly basis, that might be 0.2 points or something. And so when the margins are so slim, when the difference between that late third and the mid second is kind of a, hey, 52-48 between like who actually finishes higher, guaranteeing that you can get something unique, which is not many people have that Jameer and Nico, so that if they actually both go off in week 17, that's a lot more likely for you to get to jump up the leaderboard than if Nico and London go. If Gibbs and London go, and actually 20% of the field has that combo.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. What do you think of sort of the wide receiver meta, I guess I would call it, at this point, with prices the way they are? I know when you won BBM, things were totally different from a market standpoint. Do you think that people have taken zero RB/hero RB too far? Or do you think that this is sort of the way that it should be, and this is the way that people should have been drafting maybe for the last few years?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting like what the landscape looked like when I did win it back 4 or so years ago. I've been known as kind of the hyper fragile RB bro because when I did win that BBM, also a lot of my portfolio that year was tons of this hyper fragile. And I went heavy into that strategy because, hey, I'll draft 4 rounds. I'll do it in the 4 RBs in the first like kind of 9 or 10 rounds. But I knew I could get guys like Garrett Wilson in the 11th or 12th round. You had wide receivers that were available in those early double digits that had substantial upside. So I'm not giving up like, hey, this wide receiver big hits by only focusing the running backs early on. That doesn't exist anymore. Even Jamar Chase, when he was a rookie, we were lucky he was falling to like the 6th round because he couldn't catch because the balls with the stripes and stuff. Yeah. But like now you've got Marvin Harrison going literally at the end of the first round. And then what? You look at Rome Odunze, you look at Brian Thomas, also the 3rd, 4th best wide receiver prospects, early and mid first rounders. And they're the number 3 options on their team, if not number even 4, depending on like what you want to argue. But they're still going so much earlier. They're still going in like the 7th round now. If this was 4 years ago, those guys are going 11th, 12th, 13th round. And so it'd be more feasible to say, I'm going to focus on getting some elite QB, elite tight end, a little more running backs early because I know I can get those wide receivers. That doesn't exist now. So now, yes, wide receivers are expensive as they've ever been, but like you kind of got to pay the toll. You got to say like, I'm going to if you miss out on it, you can do your zigging and zagging. But if you miss out on the wide receiver early, it's just really hard to get that firepower and make up for it with quantity and that depth later on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the consistent answer to this has basically been what you just said, where it's like, what else are you going to do, man? Like there are all these wide receivers flying off the board. You can't just not do that because you're going to be stuck without good wide receivers, which are obviously important for these builds. And then the other thing that I think that at least I've noticed is that, like, you can also think of it as the one position that will not fall in drafts is usually wide receiver. Like, not many people are going to find, like a Rome Odunze, let's say, or someone in that 6th round range just like fall to the 8th. Like, it just doesn't happen. Whereas, Rachaad White was in the 4th round, a month ago, and now you can get him in the early 7th often. Like, it's not like uncommon for something like that to happen. So these other positions are falling a lot more. So if you're really trying to just gobble up value, good luck doing it at wide receiver at this point, because everyone freaking loves these wide receivers.
You wanted to do like the zig versus zag because you're like, oh, everyone's going wide receiver. There's a smart way to do it. Go with wide receiver with your first 3 picks and then wait a whole bunch. Now you've still invested heavily at the wide receiver when other people are, and you're not really missing ground. And now in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, you can get an elite QB, an elite tight end, a pretty strong running back, and you're kind of taking that zigzag method where it's like, hey, I don't want to just go crazy at wide receiver. Those 3 that you've drafted in the first 3 rounds are probably really solid. Now, maybe later on, you can grab a Cortland Sutton. You can grab a stack partner, someone that, like, maybe they don't have the greatest medium, but they have maybe a weekly upside. Maybe with the rest of your 4 or 5 that you're going to grab later on, you can piecemeal together 1 or 2 kind of weekly spots. But that's where you can get unique without just kind of throwing your hands up and saying, I'm just not going for wide receivers.
Pete Overzet, what in your mind has been sort of the most difficult thing, sort of the most difficult hurdle this season that may not have popped up as much in the past?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately with my drafts. I'm like 50 plus BBM drafts deep, so I feel like I have a pretty good lay of the land about how these are shaking out. And I was thinking about it compared to last year, where I thought strategically it kind of was a simple setup where it was a really good year for late round tight end. It was a really good year for late round quarterback. You had the Strouds, the Loves, and this isn't just revisionist history. People loved this rookie tight end class. People loved all of those late quarterback options. And then on top of that, we had the market continuing to push up wide receivers, and that created all of the favorable prices for the dead zone running backs. And so to me last year, it was like, you get wide receivers, grab a Breece Hall here, get some receivers, grab a James Cook or a Travis Etienne. And it was pretty straightforward. This year, I feel like there's so many values at each position in the early rounds where it's really hard to know, is this the draft I do the Josh Allen Kincaid or the Andrews Lamar? Is this the draft where I grab both Pacheco and Etienne because I think they're good values? And I think in any one draft, I feel comfortable. But from a portfolio standpoint, it's been tricky to be like, what is the biggest edge I want to push this year? And I've kind of defaulted to elite tight end, but then I see how little Isaiah Pacheco or Joe Mixon and I have. And I'm like, these guys could be absolute smashes. So it's just weighing, like, there's lots of values. Which one am I going to prioritize the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, really being nimble too, right? And being reactive to what's going on in those early rounds. Because what I've noticed is, like, the way that things sort of set up in rounds 1 through 3, especially, you can start to build stacks even that early, right? Like, if you want to go heavy Miami, if you're in the front half of the draft, you can go heavy Miami if you want to. Or if you want, like, that Rams Cardinals stack going, you could get that hypothetically with like a McBride in round 4 or something like that, and maybe reaching for him slightly and start to get that correlation going. But then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can get Lamar and Andrews. Okay, that plan that I had, forget that plan. I'm getting this Raven stack and kind of going from there. And so I do feel that as well. It sort of plays into what you're saying, where, like, there's just a lot of different directions that you can go in, where, seemingly, I wasn't doing as much volume last year, but seemingly last year, it did appear as though there was more of this, like, blueprint to sort of follow and go through. Now it's just it seems like you can go in a lot of different directions. Yeah. And I mean, I always try to approach it from, like, a humility-based standpoint. Like, going back to the elite tight end thing, it's like, I think elite tight end's a pretty big edge. But then I start to think through some 2v2s, like an example, looking at the Pacheco blind spot. And I'm also really into Brock Bowers. And so I'm like, do I want every team to be a Mark Andrews and, let's say, a Jalen Warren?
Or do I want some teams to be an Isaiah Pacheco with Brock Bowers? And it's like, you don't want to be so overconfident on one side, even if you like it maybe 55, 60% more, just knowing that still 40, 45% of the time, that other side of the strategy can get there.
Yeah. And really what you're talking about here is exposure and managing that exposure. Are you aiming for certain exposure numbers for your early round guys versus your middle round players versus your late round players? Do you really care what your exposure numbers just generally look like, across the board? This is actually something, I've talked to a handful of best ball bros so far on the show. Haven't really dug into the exposure conversation that much. So how are you handling that?
Yeah, it's funny because, last year I streamed all 150 of my drafts, and almost 2/3 of them were with guests of some sort. And when I draft with guests, I like to defer to the people I'm drafting with. Sometimes I'll break a tie or we don't get it in time. But what happened because of that is I had naturally diversified portfolio, because I draft with Pat. He wants to take James Cook in every draft. I draft with Sean and he wants to do something else. And so I had smoothed out exposures. And, some people thought that was weird. People want to go and get your stands. But the way I've kind of decided to approach drafts is like, I want to make the best possible team for that specific room. And sometimes that is going to involve a player take. I mentioned Brock Bowers earlier. He's a guy I like a lot. But a lot of times I'm going to have an elite tight end before him, and I'm not going to get to Brock Bowers. And so I think I'm pretty fluid with it. I will say this year, I was trying to be more heavy on my player takes early on and being like, hey, a guy like Jaden Daniels, he's at 120 when the contest opened. I had like 35% Jaden Daniels off the rip. Now I've kind of cooled off. I still mix him in, but I'm down to like 16 or 17% because I was like, I'm going to hammer these player takes early and then let drafts come to me later. So I'm trying to balance that of, having more player takes while also still being like, I think I can build really good teams with different types of players.
Are you okay with being overweight on certain guys that you have a good feeling will then, rise in price later in the offseason, especially with Best Ball Mania, where the contest itself isn't this short duration, where, I was talking to Herzig last week about some of these contests where we know it's going to fill in a week. And so differentiating, say, in round 1 and round 2, and maybe getting and reaching for a round 2 player to just have a slightly different lineup than everyone else, because the contest is going to close very quickly, as opposed to Best Ball Mania going on all summer. We're going to see ADP spikes and drops and guys getting hurt and all these other things that we're not going to have with the mini Schnauzer, right? Like in these other contests, right? And so from that perspective, let's say, I'm drafting Waddle right now and lots of Waddle. Should I stop drafting Waddle because I'm trying to limit my exposure and be smart with my exposure? Or am I making this bet on Waddle and saying, hey, I think that he might be like an early second round pick by the time August rolls around?
For sure. And I do think it's really nice to have those time box contests versus the BBM, because you can approach things strategically. I've been thinking about that exact example you laid out as it pertains to Jonathan Brooks. Like, I really like Jonathan Brooks. I have 20% of him in Best Ball Mania, but I've recently started to take my foot off the gas, not because I'm not still bullish on him, but I'm telling you, when he opens up on the pup list for camp, the market's going to overreact and drop him around.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, if I keep hammering him now, and then I keep hammering him when he gets cheaper, I'm going to have like 40, 45, 50%. Exactly, right. And I'm like, I like him, but not that much more than the other backs going in his range. So I was like, you know what? I'll take my foot off the gas now, and I'll get my cheaper Jonathan Brooks when that happens. But on the flip side, say the puppy drops today, which I actually think it is, and that contest closes soon. It's like, all right, if Jonathan Brooks is one of my guys this year, go get him. Like, where his price moves in 2 weeks isn't going to matter if that contest closes in a week.
Right, exactly. And look, hey, I'm a Jonathan Brooks truther as well. We're going to say that ADP is going to rise because that man is going to be healthy and he's going to play, and we're going to love it. But no, I mean, like, it's a very, very real feeling overall.
And that's the thing too, in where you can get yourself in trouble. I don't know for a fact that he's going to open up on the camp pup, or it's, it could be like you said, they could say, holy cow, he's back here at training camp and looking incredible. And it could slingshot the other direction. Yeah. And then you regret, oh man, I wish I would have been taking more. But it is kind of trying to understand where the market is going. And I do feel confident in general that the market loves to kind of double count news things. Like, say Rashi Rice's ADP right now, I would this is me just doing like back of the napkin bro math. I would say the market is like baking in like a 7 to 8 game suspension right now. I think if Rashi Rice got hit with a 6-game suspension tomorrow, his ADP would drop a little bit.
Mike Leone, should we be doing Best Ball Mania drafts where they span, the entire summer, where, they begin in May, end in August? Should we be sort of skewing our drafts towards the August date as opposed to May and June? Or is it okay to do it in May and June because there's the possibility for some crazy ADP values?
Yeah, it's a somewhat complicated question. Like, I think my first instinct is just say, like, everybody's goals are different. Like, Herzig is drafting so many best ball teams across so many different formats that he can say, I'm going to do Best Ball Mania, where I think it's like the absolutely optimal time because I'm drafting all these other best ball teams right now. I'm drafting like a higher percentage of my portfolio will be Best Ball Mania. And in order to max it, I'm kind of just entering when I can, realistically. Like, so from a fun perspective, like, I'm okay with just people playing when they can. Now, if you're looking at exactly what's optimal, I do think waiting until late July, early August is probably your sweet spot, where there's a little bit more information known so that you're not wasting late round picks. You've also had less time to kind of get screwed over by injuries over the course of the offseason. We learn more about players. So I think it's like a good junction of like getting that information, but then also still having enough time that you can get a lot of closing line ADP value. So where you take players in July and August versus where their ADP finishes come September, there's just a lot more room for you to get really, really good values. Whereas if you draft late August, early September, right before the season, it's just gonna be hard to get a ton of value on your player takes.
Yeah, I think the point too of just like being able to actually get the 150 in, like time-wise, is something that I'm kind of probably underestimating a little bit, right now with this lull. I mean, look, I've already, like I said, I've done probably 40, so I'm not at that bad of a pace right now. But I do think that I have to flip that switch at least a little bit into July instead of just waiting until late July to get all of those done.
You got to avoid slow draft hell come when they start reducing the timer towards
That's a good point too. Yeah.
That's the mistake I made last year. Was I was like, oh, dude, I went on vacation the beginning of August. When I got back, I'm like, I'll just like enter basically 150 slow drafts and I'll be fine. And I only got to 58 teams in Best Ball Mania, and like 10% of those teams reach the slow draft hell, where like they have to fill it, make sure it fills the drafts finish before the start of the season, so they start cutting the timer down.
That's a good point too. That this is folks. This is why I'm doing this show, is because I don't think about the timers changing. Because I remember that happened. It happens before the NFL draft as well, where they want drafts to be finished before the NFL draft happens, right, so that they can fill those and make sure that you don't have any sort of advantage of knowing where guys landed for those pre-draft drafts. But then I remember it happening to me last year as well. Not to the scale of what you're talking about, but that is a very, very important caveat to remember. Are there any major differences in strategy that you would take when you're looking at a structure like BBM versus, say, like a puppy, where you still have that week 15 to 17 playoff in both of these tournaments and both these contests, but maybe there are some things that you structurally change, or maybe there are some players that you would go after or not go after? Is there anything that you would change, in your mentality when going from, let's say, a BBM to a puppy too?
So I think the overall builds for me are going to look pretty similar. If you look at the playoff structure, it's not that dissimilar from Best Ball Mania. You still want to optimize for that week 17 final. We'll talk about weeks 15 and 16 stacking, I think, in a little bit, but like there's an element of that, maybe not quite as important as in Best Ball Mania, because the pod sizes are a little bit smaller in the puppy. The big difference for me is it's going to fill in such a short amount of time. And then that brings in some game theory stuff in terms of unique combinations and unique players that you might want to look at. I'm someone that, in terms of Best Ball Mania, I don't like, let's say, to reach on ADP at the 2-3 turner, for example, to get a combination that I don't think people are drafting because the ADPs don't align. Because over the entire summer, those ADPs might change, and then it's like, well, you got a really bad price, and now come the end of the summer, they're not even a unique combination, and that's bad. Whereas the puppy, like if that thing fills in a week, or for example, you might have more confidence that you're getting a unique combination and those players aren't owned a lot together, and that matters more. And same thing for players at the end of the draft, where in Best Ball Mania right now, round 16 to 18, I don't really care what the perceived ownership on these players is, because chances are if I draft someone because I think they're going to be super low owned, two things could happen. One, we get information on that player that is really positive, and it's like, okay, you got maybe a little bit of value, but so many drafts are yet to happen, and that player is going to end up not low owned by the end of the tournament anyways. Or we get negative information on the player. They stay low owned, but they stay low owned for a reason. So I'm waiting until like August in Best Ball Mania to worry about unique players. The puppy's totally different because you don't have that dynamic where if you get the positive news and you drafted a low owned guy in the puppy, like, you're home free because that player can't be drafted anymore because the contest is closed. So that's like the main difference, some of the game theory with getting unique combinations and lower owned players on your roster.
Yeah, I really like that. Not just thinking about the top of your draft, but also the tail end of your draft. Because I think the unique combination thing at the early parts of your draft is something that a lot of people brought up and talked about, but the tail end is something that people have not brought up nearly as much because, the contest is going to close a lot sooner. And if you're able to get someone who then rises in July as opposed to June, then you're going to get really good value out of that player. But the other thing I want to add to this about like the unique combination piece, is there a point in time where you're forcing that a little bit more in your draft?
Yeah, I think especially in terms of correlation and stacking, you can always sacrifice a little bit of ADP value, especially if it's going to give you a unique combination. It's tough to kind of like draw that line between like how much value do you give up versus like taking on the correlation. But I think the correlated aspect of it gives you like an additional out to the uniqueness. If we're talking like purely unique combos, it's something I struggle with. I talked with Eric Beimfor of Spike Week on my Establish the Edge podcast, and he's a little bit more game theory than me. And I'm kind of boring the way, I would just hate to like reach on combinations and then like maybe towards the end of the summer, when those combos are set a little bit more firmly and you can really be confident that it's going to be unique, you could do it. But the way I like to get unique, which is really boring, but like take advantage of ADP fallers when I can, even if it doesn't necessarily fit with the build that I'm doing. I have a Josh Allen, Jordan Love team that I just drafted, and generally that's too much draft capital invested in the quarterback position. You wouldn't want to take Jordan Love with Josh Allen, but I got Jordan Love almost 2 rounds past ADP with a couple of Green Bay pass catchers also past ADP. Now I'm looking at like the best possible version of a Josh Allen, Jordan Love team. So that's the way I like to do it. And in terms of like bully tight end, I think of this too, where I know we're talking about tight ends a little bit, but like I'm happy to grab an elite tight end. I'm generally not trying to get 2 of those top 7 guys, but there's instances where, I've got one of the top 5 or whatever, and George Kittle falls, half a round, full round past ADP, and I'll take him as my second tight end. Then I start to get combinations that people probably haven't drafted a lot, but I got it at a really, really good price, which, makes it better than other versions that people have of this, I guess.
As always, you can find my stuff over on lateround.com. Late round draft guide. It will be out next week, so make sure you pre-order that. There's also, you can use promo code LateRound over on Underdog and get that thing for free. You'll get emailed the copy of the guide on July 1st when that drops. But otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.